The topic we're going to be looking at today is the topic of reverse acquisitions, also known as a reverse takeover. I will get into first what it is and explain the details of that, and secondly, I will explain how they are handled from an accounting standpoint. A reverse acquisition happens when a private company purchases enough shares of a public company to take control and merge the two. When the public company comes under the control of the private company, it becomes what's known as a shell company. It's called a shell company because it ultimately is only an empty shell. It's only made up of the organizational structure that remains of the public company. Now that the private company owns a controlling interest in the shell company, it has essentially gone public. The shareholders of the private company will then swap their shares of the private company for the shares of the public shell company. They now own public shares of a company that is controlled by their original private company, which ultimately accomplishes the goal of going public. The alternative to a reverse acquisition is an initial public offering, or an IPO. An IPO is when a private company goes public by issuing brand new shares to the public. Going public with your private company's shares is a great way to raise capital. However, the downside to an IPO is that it is very expensive and it's very time-consuming. The reason that a reverse acquisition is preferable to an IPO is that it takes much less time and it's much more affordable, and it ultimately accomplishes the same goal of becoming a publicly traded company. The reason it's called a reverse acquisition is because it's contrary to a normal acquisition where it's typically a larger company buying a smaller company. With the reverse acquisition, it's often a smaller company that's private who is purchasing a controlling interest in a larger public company and ultimately stepping into their shoes to then take advantage of being public. For example, if you have a small privately held bakery who wants to go public but they can't afford to raise enough money for an IPO, they could look for a publicly held bakery who is maybe struggling, which would make their shares be cheaper. The private company is not concerned about the operations of the public company. They're simply looking for an affordable way to gain the status of publicly traded. So the small privately held bakery then buys a controlling interest in the publicly held bakery in order to merge the two and become publicly traded. From an accounting standpoint, privately held companies are not required to disclose as much detail in their financial statements as publicly held companies are. So when a reverse acquisition occurs, the privately held company will then become a new entity that is publicly traded, so their accounting will have to adjust and then comply to all those regulations. The new entity will then need to prepare consolidated financial statements, just like a regular acquisition. In terms of journal entries, a reverse acquisition ultimately boils down to a few distinct transactions. The first is when the private company acquires a controlling interest in the shares of the public company. The main transaction to watch for is when the shareholders of the private company exchange their stock in the private company for the shares of the new publicly traded company. They're essentially turning in the shares of the old one for the new shares of the new combined entity. On the books of the private company, this can be shown as a debit to investment in subsidiary and a credit to common stock. To summarize the reverse acquisition, it's a method for private companies to go public without having to jump through the hoops of an IPO. By purchasing a controlling interest in a already publicly traded company, the private company can then step into their shoes of that shell company and then essentially take on the status of being publicly traded. Reverse acquisitions are a very important aspect of business, and as accountants, it's very important to know how to handle them.